begin the introduction. So I'm very pleased that we finally managed to get Professor Christophe Jaffrelot to a center webinar. It's taken a couple of semesters of trying and fixing dates and so on. So at least you know how much in demand he is. As you may know, he's the Senior Research Fellow at the Center for International Research at Sciences Po in Paris. He's also Professor of Indian Politics and Sociology at the King's India Institute, that's King's College University of London, and a non-resident fellow of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, DC. He's also president of the French Political Science Association. Among his recent publications, of course, he has so many publications, I'll just mention the very recent ones, which include two co-edited books, one entitled Business and Politics in India, and the other, The Majoritarian State, How Hindu Nationalism is Changing India. He also has a co-authored monograph with Pratinav Anil entitled India's First Dictatorship, The Emergency 1975 to 1977. And looking at the title and the abstract for the talk today, it seems to combine the themes of the two co-edited books, namely issues around socio-economic development and inequality with issues around political, ethno-religious developments and inequalities. So thank you very much, Professor Jaffrelot, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Derek and Thomas, for organizing this. And my apologies for the delay, but that has been a very difficult semester, I must say. So I'm glad it's over and we can now go back to research. Let me share my screen immediately in order to let you see this presentation that I have called the deepening and diversification of inequalities in India. And this is a presentation that is based on data we have collected and processed and analyzed with Kalai Yarasan, who is my partner in crime, in a forthcoming book, in fact, that we are dedicating to these issues. In between, by the way, this summer in July, my book on Modi's India will be published. But that's a translation that I have updated from a French manuscript that was published in 2019. Diversification and deepening of inequalities in India. Well, inequalities are on the rise. In different ways, in different forms. You have the traditional forms of inequalities along class lines and the urban-rural divide, which have increased, particularly since 1991, in the post-liberal era, which did not mean that the poorer were getting poorer, at least till the recent COVID crisis. That was not the case, but that meant that the gap between the rich and the poor, to use a very simplified formula, was increasing. And I will refer to these traditional forms of inequalities in the beginning of my presentation. But of course, other forms of inequality have crystallized and are more interesting because they are new. And in this presentation, I would like to focus on two recent phenomena. And the first one is the making of class differentiation within caste groups. I'll focus on the dominant caste groups, but with Kalai, we have done the same research among Dalit caste groups. I'll be, of course, happy in the discussion to return to that. And the other more recent form of inequality that I will focus upon in the last part of my talk today is the decline of Muslims vis-à-vis other religious communities, and Muslims as a bloc, which is of course counterintuitive, and that of course contrasts with the previous point. Caste does not make such a big difference within Muslims so far as inequalities are concerned. There is one variable that is still missing there, and that is gender. We are working on it. To do justice to gender is not easy. By the way, it's more and more difficult to work on inequalities in India today because you have less and less access to data, and data are not collected and publicized the way they were. That's a kind of caveat, a kind of footnote, but a very, very important one. NSS data, for instance, are not as easily accessible as they used to be, and for gender in particular. So I will not address the gender issue, but it's a major issue. And we know that it is a major issue because we see that work participation of women, I mean, the participation of women on the job market has become really problematic. And we may return to that in the Q&A as well. So let me proceed and first of all, use this well-known graph that Piketty and his team have put together recently, and which shows that India is one of the countries, in fact, the country, where inequalities have increased the most in the 21st century. And this is something that is largely due to the 1%, the Indian 1%. According to Piketty and his team, this 1% represent more than 22% of the national income share. And this is something that, of course, you can certainly somewhat symbolize by looking at the fact that more than 100 Indian billionaires in 2018, 2019 represented as much money as the budget of India. But I would like to go beyond the 1% and see that the 10%, the Indian 10%, lags behind South Africa only in terms of the percentage of the national income. More than 57% of the national income were seen in the end of the 10% by Piketty and his team. And of course, as a correlatively, the middle 40% represented less than 30% of the national income. So inequalities have definitely increased. And if you look at these graphs, you see that the 1990s were the turning point, unsurprisingly. Liberalization contributed to the rise of inequalities. And of course, with liberalization came globalization and so on and so forth. Well, this is something we can look at in a more detailed manner. If we use the different sources that are the All India Debt and Investment Survey, the Indian Human Development Survey, and the National Sample Survey NSS data for the years precisely 1991, 2012. 2012 is the year of the last round of the Indian Human Development Survey, one of the best sources that I will use repeatedly, sadly, a source that is now more than 10 years old, almost 10 years old. And that's a problem. But still, we can rely on it. And what does it say? It says that the richest decile of the Indian society represented something like 51% of wealth in 1991, and more than 63% in 2012. This is a clear increase, when on the contrary, in terms of income, it's more stable, whereas in terms of consumption, and this is the NSS survey, we still see some increase from 26% to 35%. So inequalities have increased in terms of income and therefore also in terms of consumption. Now, if we try to disaggregate these large categories, income, consumption, we need to go beyond that. And we need to go beyond class, because what we've seen so far can be analyzed in terms of class. So to disaggregate these inequalities, I will quickly review 4 approaches: the urban-rural divide, caste, but more importantly, class within caste, and then of course, religion, and we'll see what is the relation between religion and caste at the same time. Well, the rural-urban divide is of course epitomized by this cartoon that I really like, because it condenses the despair of the peasantry. Some peasants are so desperate that they commit suicide, and this is what this cartoon is suggesting, because the city is prospering at the expense of the rural part of the country. Well, this is something that the NSS tells us very clearly. And if you look at this statistical series, you see a steady, absolutely linear trend, that almost linear. There are some asymmetries there, but by and large, it's a linear trend, which shows that the ratio of urban to rural in terms of monthly per capita expenditures have evolved at the expense of the rural part of the country. The peasantry, I would not say the peasantry, those who live in villages, this is the point. They may be artisans, it makes hardly any difference, is now consuming much less than the urban part of the country. The ratio has jumped from 1.63 in 1994 to 2.42 in 2018. 2018, you may remember, this survey has leaked. In fact, it was not supposed to be released, but it is reliable. And it shows that this trend has accelerated between the early 2010s and the late 2010s. If you look at the percentage of rural poor, you see also a share that is very, very large, and especially in some states. BR, more than 34% of the poor living below the poverty line. Gujarat, a model state, yes, but with a very big gap between urban and rural population, 21.5% below the poverty line. Karnataka, same story, a very rich state. If you look at Bangalore, a state where the peasantry is struggling, if you look at the world picture, and in particular to village Karnataka. Madhya Pradesh, of course, Maharashtra. And in Maharashtra, the contrast is not only between urban and rural, but also between the eastern part, Vidarbha, that is known as the suicide belt, because peasants doing cotton have been particularly affected by that, and the rest of the state. Orissa and surprisingly Uttar Pradesh and surprisingly have large percentage of people living below the poverty line. That's something you can explain, of course, by looking at the rural wages and inflation. What does it say? What does it say? It says that after years of increase of the peasants' income, basically the UPA years, the NRAGA years, after these good years, since 2014, you can be more, I would say, fair with the Modi government by saying that it started before. As early as 2012, in fact, we saw a gap between the nominal wages and the agricultural wage that became unfavorable to the peasants. Let's move on, because this question of rural versus urban is rather well known, and I would like to now explore topics which are less well known. And this is the role of caste and subcaste hierarchies. And within this world of caste, we need to look now at class more closely. And that's what we have done with Kalai. And one of the groups we will now focus upon are the dominant caste. And this is what this graph that Kalai has done is very useful, even though it is very simple, but especially for those who are not well versed in Indian sociology. And I'm sorry for the others, but I will say very basic things now. It's important to know that the largest caste groups in India are, in most of the states, dominant castes. Of course, the largest of the largest are the Marathas, who represent more than 30% of Maharashtra's society, but Patels in Gujarat, Jats in Haryana, Punjab, Rajasthan to some extent, West UP for sure, are also very large caste. And we will look more precisely what's going on in among these caste groups in the coming slides. These caste groups are still very affluent, lagging behind the Brahmins only for work caste at large. You look at the if you look at the income, the mean income, the per capita mean income of these groups, and that's something the Indian Human Development Survey allows us to do, you see that Marathas come next to Brahmins only. In 2004, 2005, they were behind the other forward castes, including Banyas of Maharashtra. But in 2011, 2012, they have become number 2. So caste inequalities are, if you look at these aggregates, not very surprising. Brahmins come number 1, Marathas number 2, Malis, who are OBCs, other OBCs, and then Dalits. Surprisingly, Kunbis come after Dalits, but we'll return to the dynamic of Dalits in Maharashtra. And last, of course, are Adivasis, tribals. So a hierarchy that shows that caste inequalities have remained more or less what we expected. More or less the same story in Gujarat, except that Patels are number one. They were number two in 2004, sorry, 2005, behind Brahmins, like in Maharashtra. But in 2011, 2012, they benefited so much, they had benefited so much from the economic liberalization and the double-digit growth rate of Gujarat that they became number one. So Patels number one, Brahmins number two, other forward caste number three, Kolis, which are OBCs, Dalits, other OBCs, and again, last, Adivasis. Haryana, same story almost, except that Brahmins are not very affluent in Haryana. In fact, Haryana, Punjab are states where Brahmins have never been very prestigious and very affluent. So other forward caste, of course, Khatris, Banias are number one in Haryana. Jats are number two. And you have the usual hierarchy with OBCs and SCs coming last. Well, this needs to be seen in perspective. And I will now look at other indicators before looking at the main question for me, that is class within caste. Well, the main indicators are primarily education. And if you look at education, and we will revisit Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Haryana, you see that Marathas are number two in terms of income, in spite of being not that great in terms of education. Only 8% of Marathas have graduated, not much more than OBCs, 7.6%, and less than Malis in 2011, 2012. Keep this in mind, because this low level of education will find expression in some decline, in some socio-economic decline, when we look at class groups within Marathas. Same with Patels. Patels are better educated, but still less than 10% of them are graduates, much less than Brahmins. And Jats are even worse. Jats in Haryana are less educated than OBCs. Only 5.1% of them are graduates, against 5.4% for OBCs. What does this tell us? It tells us that these dominant castes have not invested in education. And that's largely because they are Kisans, they are peasants, and education has never been something they have valued. As a result, if you look at the dynamic, if you look not at the figures as they are in 2011, 2012, but if you look at the percentages of growth of the percentage of graduates caste-wise, you realize that those who are catching up because they invest in education are mostly Dalits and OBCs. In Maharashtra, OBCs and Dalits in Gujarat, and Dalits and OBCs again in Haryana. But the percentage, the growth rate of the proportion of graduates among dominant caste comes after the same proportion among Dalits and OBCs. Very important point, because it means that these castes which used to be at the bottom of the pyramid for good are moving out, are moving on, are catching up to some extent. And it's also true to some extent in terms of access to salaried jobs. The percentage of those who have a salaried job is not so small for Dalits, and for good reasons, reservations. They come second to Marathas in Maharashtra. They are number one in Gujarat when compared to Patels and OBCs. We have not kept all the caste groups there, but the comparison now is between Dalits, OBCs, and dominant caste groups. This is what we are interested in. So Patels lag behind Dalits in terms of access to salaried jobs, in Gujarat, and Jats lag behind both OBCs and Dalits in Haryana. So dominant caste have not invested in education and are now under clear pressure from Dalits and OBCs so far as access to salaried jobs is concerned. And of course, that goes together with the fact that, as I have said, dominant caste groups are still peasants, cultivators. They are confined, many of them are confined to village life. It's very much true for Marathas, for Patels, and for Jats. Patels being, of course, the most urbanized ones. Patels are a very interesting caste group because they have turned to trade and they have also migrated overseas very early. But still, you have more than 40% of Patels who are still cultivators. Now, what is the result of these trends that we have reviewed? Well, the first consequence is a socio-economic differentiation within caste. Within the dominant caste groups, those who have not invested in education, those who have stayed in the village, those who have not got a salaried job, are now lagging behind the Dalits and the OBCs who have invested in education, who have had access to salaried jobs. And this finds translation into income differentiations as well. So in this table, and that's the main, I would say, finding of the work Kalai and I have done, you see that the mean income of the bottom 60% of the dominant caste, the last three quintiles, are below the mean income of Dalits and OBCs in Maharashtra, in Gujarat, and in Haryana. SCs are still behind, but OBCs are now ahead of these 60% of the dominant caste. Why do we do this? Why have we spent so much time looking at this data? Because this is the reason why Patels, Marathas, and Jats ask for reservations, considering that they are not in a better position than OBCs and SCs. At least 60% of them are not in a better position than SCs and OBCs in terms of income, and therefore they deserve reservations, reservations being one of the assets Dalits and OBCs are, of course, benefiting from. So this is, I think, the table that shows, that encapsulates the question of, well, why do some OBCs deserve, or at least need, reservation? Because of class differentiation within caste. This is just reconfirming what I've just said. Class differentiation is very well reflected in the income distribution by quintiles across the caste group. One quintile represents 48% almost of the income of the Marathas. The concentration of resources is that great, and therefore others are much poorer. The concentration has not increased between 2004 and 2012 in Maharashtra among Marathas, but it has among Patels. The rich Patels are now cornering more than 61% of the income of the Patels. Huge concentration, 20%, that's what it means. 20% of the caste group gets 61% of the income of the caste. And in Haryana, the situation is very similar. There is a clear increase of class differentiation and a clear concentration of the resources of the income in the hands of a minority, of a small proportion of the caste group. That's for caste and class. Let's turn now briefly, well, not so briefly, because this is a very important topic and I would like to do justice to it, to Muslims. Muslims are now at the bottom of the pyramid of India's society. And this is something that was true even before the 2014 election. It's not something that resulted from the new dispensation, and the figures, the data that we are going to use now are particularly interesting because precisely they are pre-2014. These data are the ones I've used already, we have used already for the caste story, the Indian Human Development Survey. And Kalavi and I have focused on 15 states representing an overwhelming proportion of Indian Muslims. 95% of the 170 million Muslims enumerated in the 2011 census are part of the sample, which is therefore very meaningful. What does it say? Well, it says that in contrast to what we have just seen, caste makes hardly any difference so far as income is concerned among Muslims. Let me just read out the last sentences of this rather dense slide. The difference between OBC Muslims and non-OBC Muslims is lesser compared to the gap that remains between Hindu OBCs and other Hindus. Incidentally, this is also due to the fact that among the Muslim OBCs, you have also the Dalit OBCs, because there is, Dalit Muslims, because Dalit Muslims are not recognized as a separate category. So that makes the OBC Muslims mechanically poorer than the Hindu OBCs. The average per capita income of OBC Muslims was 19,263 rupees as against 20,490 rupees for the upper caste Muslims in 2011-2012, a marginal 4% difference. In other words, caste is not making any significant difference in terms of income inequality among Muslims. And this is one of the reasons why we have not differentiated the Muslim community caste-wise. Whereas you need to do it for Hindus, of course. We have the difference between OBCs and upper caste is much more, 64%. So if we look at Muslims as a block, we don't need to look at caste within Muslims. And if we compare Indian Muslims to other caste groups, big aggregates, in terms of income, we can definitely see a trend. The trend is Muslims are earning less than Dalits in an increasingly large number of Indian states. And this table shows that in 2004-2005, Muslims earned 7,750 rupees, a little bit more than Dalits, who were earning 7,142 rupees. Sorry. In 2011-2012, the number of states in which Muslims have lost ground vis-à-vis Dalits has increased, and as a result, Dalits earn more, slightly more, than Muslims at an all India level. This is something that can be explained by the percentage of Muslims who have access to a salaried job. Same story, the number of states where Muslims do not have access to salaried job as much as Dalits has increased, which means that in 2004-2005, the percentage of Muslims having access to a salaried job and the percentage of Dalits having access to a salaried job was almost the same. 13.3% for Muslims, 13.5% for Dalits. In 2011-2012, the percentage of Dalits who get a salaried job is now almost 15%, and the percentage of Muslims who have access to a salaried job is now less than 13%. It was more than 13%, it is now less than 13%. And that's 2011-2012. That's 10 years ago. You can imagine how things have changed. Well, this is clearly a reflection of reservations again. Dalits have access to reservation, and Muslims, on the contrary, may very well be victims of discrimination on the job market, especially in the public sector. That's what Sachar committee report had told us, and that committee report was of course published in 2005 or 6. Last but not least, all this has to do with education. And we are back to our indicator, percentage of graduates among Muslim people and among not Dalits this time, because Muslims are not lagging behind Dalits in terms of education at that time, 2012, but lagging behind OBCs. The percentage of graduates among Muslims was 3.7% in 2012, and it was almost 5% among Hindu OBCs. But we have the 2018 data that show that, in fact, since 2012, the situation has changed. Of course, the source is not the same. We don't have the Indian Human Development Survey yet, but we have the NSS Office Periodic Labor Force Survey that says that now we have 14% of Muslims who have graduated among those who belong to the bracket of 21 to 29 years old, when Dalits are ahead, 4 percentage points ahead, with 18% of them being graduates. And of course, OBCs are now almost 10 percentage points ahead at 25. Muslims are lagging behind in such a way that we see now the elite of Muslims in terms of education becoming very small. And that's very disturbing, because the future is largely in the hands of the elite of different communities, and the elite of educated Muslims is shrinking. Which means, and I return to the previous period, because I return to the IHDS, the IHDS of 2004, 2005, and 2011, 2012 tell us that in terms of income, Muslims are lagging behind Dalits now. In 2004, 2005, the salary, the income of the Muslims were 108% of the income of the Dalits. In 2011, 2012, the income of the Muslims is 90%, represents 98%, sorry, of the income of the Dalits. And that's 2011, 2012. So you can imagine how things have changed, especially after the, I would say, policies regarding cow protection that has badly affected the meat industry, as well as the leather industry, 2 industries in which Muslims are very active. So I conclude, and I hope I've not been too long, by saying that clearly inequalities are on the rise, but it's a multifaceted process. We need to look at the quantities, the aggregated data, but we need also to look at the diversification of the forms of inequalities. And there are, of course, traditional forms of inequalities based on class, based on the urban-rural divide, based on caste. We knew that before, but now we need to disaggregate caste to look at class within caste. That's a very important dimension. And we now also need to look at religion as a major variable for explaining inequalities. Well, this is something that needs to be updated. These data are, most of them, 10 years old. And even those which are not that old, even those you could see which are based on the 2018 NSS surveys, well, predate the COVID crisis. And I will end with a graph that is pre-COVID, but that shows something unprecedented in India. The percentage of Indians living below the poverty line had already increased for the first time since the early 70s, when NSS started its surveys. And you may easily imagine that the percentage of those living below poverty line has further increased because of the COVID pandemic. And one of the jobs we'll have to do will be to do fieldwork, to collect data, because we may not get official data for quite some time. And this is a real issue, a real problem. And I think even for policymakers, this scarcity, the paucity of data will become a huge challenge. Social scientists will have probably to do their own survey, and the next one maybe, hopefully, the next round of the India Human Development Survey. And I'll close here and I'll stop sharing my screen so that I can see you again.
Thank you, Christophe. So I'll just explain to everybody how we're going to conduct the question, answers, and discussion session, which obviously we'll go into now. We'll do it like we did at the last seminar. That's to say, could you please put your questions or comments or anything else you'd like to in the Q&A function, and I'll put them to Christophe, and I'll also name you unless you choose to be anonymized. So we'll do it that way. And I see that we already do have some questions, but before I turn to those, Christophe, could I just ask just a very factual point of clarification? And this is really hanging out my ignorance on the line, but I'm sure I'm not the only one. That's all I can say. Is I may have known this once, but I don't know it today. Could you just explain a little bit more about the caste structure and reservations or any policy advantage that some class have as a result of others? And some of these class group terms like forward castes and OBCs, other backward castes, is that right? I mean, the terminology doesn't fit the ways that we talk about class structure or group structures, at least, you know, in Western Europe. So I wonder if you could just explain how that terminology settled and who gets any kinds of reservation or affirmative action or any other policy advantages. You told us that, you know, obviously Muslims don't and the dominant castes don't, but if you could just clarify that before we go into more meaty questions.
Sure. No, that's easy. Well, easy. That's easy for me, but I understand that it's not easy at all. In fact, it's very complicated, to be fair. Those who benefited from reservations first were the scheduled caste. I said Dalits because that's the way they call themselves, and I prefer to use the words they prefer themselves. Scheduled caste got reservations because of Ambedkar, by the way, as early as the British Raj period. And after independence, they got 15% of access to universities, public sector jobs, and seats in parliament and in state assemblies. 15% because it had to be proportionate to their percentage according to the census. And the census still enumerates caste so far as Dalits are concerned. That's why they are known as scheduled caste. You know, there is a schedule telling the list of the caste which have to benefit from reservations. Same for scheduled tribes, STs, Adivasis. I insist on the terminology. You invited me to speak about the terminology. I insist on it. Adivasis, those who were there before, something the BJP, the ruling party today, would deny. They don't want to admit that that there was anybody before Hindus in India. So they call them Vanavasis, those who live in the forest. But the proper name is Adivasis. Then, of course, you need to disaggregate these categories according to religious communities, because scheduled castes were supposed to be Hindus only. As early as 56, Sikh people could say, we have Dalits as well. I mean, Sikh Dalits could say, we are Dalits as well. And in fact, the proportion of Dalits among the Sikh people is so large that Punjab is the state where the reservation is the largest for scheduled caste in India. Then much later, in 1990, VP Singh acceded to the demand of Dalit Buddhists, who said, we should have access to reservations as well, because we may have converted to Buddhism, we may not be Hindu anymore, but we are still downtrodden and we need reservations. Those who are still asking for reservations and who could not among the Dalits are the Muslims and the Christians. Because, of course, at the back of the mind of the decision makers of India is the idea that if you give reservations to Dalit Christians and Dalit Muslims, then you will see more conversions to Islam and to Christianity among Dalits, because they would have nothing to lose. At the moment, Hindu Dalits would have something to lose by converting reservations. That's for the SCs and STs. OBCs got reservations again because of VP Singh, again in 1990, when he announced that he would implement the Mandal Commission report, that would say 27% of the public jobs sector would be reserved for OBCs. Why 27%? Because you had already 15% for SCs, 7% for STs, 15 plus 7 plus 27, 49. 49% of the public sector jobs could be reserved. Not more than that, because the Supreme Court had said, we don't want half, we want less than half of the public sector jobs under reservation. That was Mandal. And Mandal 2 came later on, when the same quota of 27% was also applied for OBCs in the universities, where you also have 27% of the seats reserved for the OBCs. So this is the, I would say, trajectory of reservations. And I have not looked at the situation at the state level, because that would confuse you even more, because in different states you have different policies. I'd like just to mention one thing. You have reservations for Muslims in some of the southern states. Kerala, of course, Karnataka, and Telangana is thinking about it, which shows that you can have reservations on the basis of religion. Of course, you may use proxies. You may say we use caste as a proxy, and we do give reservations to Muslims belonging to this or that caste group. But you can also use religion as a criterion for reservation. But I stop here, otherwise we'll spend the...
Thank you, that was very helpful. It actually raised more questions for me, but at least I got some idea, and I hope it was helpful to others. So now we've got quite a lot of Q&A. Looking at it in the order in which it came, I'll begin with two questions that Pran Dhawan has put to you. I'll put them both together at the same time. How should this emerging fault lines between dominant castes and backward stroke scheduled castes be formulated? Does this necessitate further classification of reservations? And the next question is, why does reservation continue to be the center of mobilization in a largely privatizing neoliberal economy? Because it was your central piece in explaining for the shifts between castes, and yet we're supposed to have a liberalized economy.
Yeah. So Pranav, as always, very good questions. These are two great questions. Well, I would say for the first one, in respect to the first one, that there is probably some need to reconsider the unit of analysis for reservations. And that will take us to another category that I have not mentioned, the differentiation within Dalits, because within Dalits, you now see a kind of bourgeoisie emerging. But this middle class Dalit middle class is made of those who, because of their family education, upbringing, can corner the quotas generation after generation. So among the Dalits, we see that we need to factor in somewhat class for redefining the classification of reservations. Similarly, among dominant caste, we see that the poor Marathas, the poor Patels, the poor Jats will never come up and leave their condition if there is no reservation program. No, caste is not sufficient anymore. To be part of a dominant caste is not sufficient anymore. We need to factor in new criteria, and that is very difficult. And it's difficult on both sides. It's very difficult to tell the Dalit middle class people, why should your son benefit from a quota because of the kind of education you have, because of the kind of affluence you have? And similarly, it's very difficult to tell OBCs that dominant caste people may deserve reservations now, in spite of the fact that people from the same caste are really rich already and dominant. That's, for me, two things which go in parallel, and that justifies that we revisit the criterion of caste for quotas. But with a caveat, the stigma of untouchability may remain so strong that rich middle class Dalits, if they lose reservations, may be marginalized again very quickly. And that's something we need to keep in mind. Why do we speak all the time about public sector in a privatized economy? Because the good jobs are with the public sector. Where are the good jobs? Not in the private sector, for a handful of people. But look at the contracts that you get in the private sector. Look at, for instance, the kind of jobs you get in Gujarat that is supposed to be a model. You get informal jobs, very badly paid, and no social security, nothing. So people are still longing for a public sector job. And this is a clear, I would say, indication that privatization has failed to generate good jobs in India. Liberalization has failed to generate good jobs in post-1991 India, in particular for the poor and middle class people. But this is a fact, and therefore people are looking for a job that is in the public sector.
Yeah, thank you. Patricia Jeffrey thanks you very much for a very illuminating talk and asks if you would, oh dear, the questions kind of moved on the screen. Here we are. She asks if you would like to speculate on the possible political electoral implications that these changing inequalities might have.
Well, it's very difficult. Patricia is asking a very good question, but you need a crystal ball in a way for responding. If we draw some lesson from the past, the recent past, in 2019, these inequalities were already there, and Narendra Modi could get away with it. You can explain this in two different ways. You can think that you don't win elections on any economic ground, socio-economic ground in India. I mean, in the India of today, that is in an India where identity politics plays such a big role. And of course, when I say identity politics, I include Pulwama, the way you mobilize against Pakistan. So that's one explanation. Another explanation is No, socio-economic issues play a role, but they have been very good at selling a form of welfarism that is not based on income. What are the big welfare-oriented programs that Narendra Modi has introduced? Swachh Bharat, Jan Dhan Yojana, Ujjwal Yojana. What does it mean? The Prime Minister gives you, because Prime Minister is always in the name of the program, huh? The Pradhan Mantri, Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, says the Prime Minister is giving you toilets. The Prime Minister is giving you a bank account. The Prime Minister is giving you a gas cylinder. He's not giving you money. On the contrary, the NREGA has been diminished. But the fact that he pays attention, that he does this for me, and this is populism, this is typically populist, because he will explain that this is for the poor. This is for the dignity of the poor. No, it's not for the pocket of the poor. The pocket is still very empty, but he pays attention to the dignity of the poor. He makes sure that women do not have to defecate in an open air field. And that worked very well. And that worked very well also because of propaganda. Never forget that this is something that has been talked about in the Man Ki Baat monthly program year after year. So the question is, if we speculate about the future, have these two resources that Modi has been able to mobilize now eroding? It's very difficult to say. My hunch is yes. And if we go by the last state elections, I would say BJP could not make it in West Bengal, could not make it in Kerala or even Tamil Nadu, and his allies could not win either, because we see some comeback of the class element in the voting pattern. Class and gender, by the way. Women voted massively for Mamata Banerjee in West Bengal, for instance. So we may speculate that Modi may not be able to rely as effectively on the tricks of yesterday in the near future, but this is speculation.
Yeah, thank you. Nazia Khan, who's a PhD scholar at JNU, she asks, do you think Muslim backwardness should be addressed through reservation, or an alternative method of upliftment can be considered, owing to the fact that reservation for OBCs and Dalits are being diluted?
This is a tricky question indeed. The Satra Committee report, and committee, not commission, very important point, recommended alternative ways to help Muslims, education, scholarships, and so on. It has not been very well implemented, and it has not been very useful when it has been implemented. I keep now thinking that in India, reservations, quotas are the best solution for groups which otherwise will remain where they are. And this is certainly the success story of post-1947 India. When you look at how Dalits, a fraction, a small fraction, but a substantial fraction of Dalits have come up because of reservations, you think that this is the recipe, this is what can work. So yes, I'm convinced that it could make some difference, and it has made some difference in the states where we have seen quotas for Muslims. I mentioned Kerala, Karnataka. This is the most robust system and the most effective system, I think. Now the problem is, as you say, as you suggest, how do we do it without diluting what OBCs and Dalits are benefiting from. This is where the question of should we go beyond the 50%, the 49% threshold is really a topical question. Under the present dispensation, I do not see neither the government nor the Supreme Court diluting this, I would say, threshold. But that could be what we could see in the future if something has to be done for the Muslims, at least at the state level. You know, Tamil Nadu does not observe a 50% threshold. 69% of the public sector jobs are under reservations. Why Tamil Nadu and not other states? That's a good question to ask.
Yeah. So I'll jump the order here. I'll come back to the one I'm jumping over because the question I'm going to go to actually relates to what you've just been talking about, Christoph. And this is anonymously put. Do you think we should go ahead with reservation of Marathas, Jats, and other dominant castes, or abolish caste reservation for the particular caste which have been growing throughout a state? For example, when education percentages of a scheduled caste meet the target, then no reservation for them in, say, Maharashtra.
This is indeed the question I alluded to responding to Pranav interrogations. In some cases, yes, we need to now consider that some families should be part of what we call the creamy layer. And never forget that in 1992, when the Mandal Commission, the Mandal reports recommendations have been implemented, the Supreme Court said the OBC people who belong to affluent families will not benefit from reservations because they are part of the creamy layer. And that was the formula. So that is something that can be more systematic. This creamy layer need to be adjusted. It has to be realistic because, of course, if you do not have a threshold that is realistic, you make no difference. You see how complicated this is. It's terribly complicated. And that's why no government will open this Pandora box easily. But if you do not try to improve the system, and if you do not try to make the creamy layer formula work properly, you will not be in a position to help those who really need the support of the state. And that's what I would consider as more appropriate compared to the other solution. That is, just forget about reservations. No, because if you forget about reservations, you give up and you make sure that inequalities, which are already on the rise in spite of reservations, continue to have devastating effects, especially in a system where there is no safety net, and there is no welfare state, there is no social security, there is no pension, there is nothing. So if you do not give reservations for those who have the most downtrodden people, you make inequalities even worse. That's what I would recommend, and that should start at the state level. You know, the most progressive states should initiate some reformulation of the creamy layer at the state level and show the way, showing that yes, we can move on, factoring in class within caste in a very innovative manner.
Thank you. There are two questions in front of me about Muslims, so I'll put them to you together. One's anonymously put. Are there any differences between Shia and Sunni Muslims in India regarding caste, reservation, employment, income, and political participation. And the other question is from Aftab Alam from the University of Delhi. He asks, in your presentation, you've mentioned that caste makes hardly any difference among Muslims in India. However, as we know, Dalit Muslims are the most marginalized community among Muslims in India. In your research, have you looked at Dalit Muslims?
Yeah, well, these are very good questions indeed. Shias are a handful minority in India. In fact, you find, I would say, substantial groups of Shias in few places. Lucknow, of course, number one. Amroha in West UP, Hyderabad somewhat, but really nothing compared to Pakistan, where we estimate that Shias are something like 1/5 of society. No, there are pockets, small pockets, and not very affluent groups. In most of the cases, you can't consider that they are above the average Muslim. They do vote differently, though, and we know that in Lucknow, in particular, Shias have been closer to Hindus in Lucknow than to Sunnis. In fact, you have Shia Sunni riots in Lucknow, and that started in the early years of the 20th century. We have the first examples of riots in the first decade of the 20th century. Gradually, Shias have been more or less co-opted by Jansang and then BJP. Shias are good Muslims for the BJP. It's an interesting category to such an extent that when there is a Muslim minister in a BJP government, he has to be a Shia. I mean, at least there is one who has to be a Shia. Presently, the only Muslim minister in Modi's government is a Shia. So that's something you can explain, because minorities within minorities can join hands with the majority, and therefore the enemy of my enemy becomes my friend. You can also explain this because of the Iranian connection, and BJP has always looked at Iran as not a Muslim country primarily, but the country next to Pakistan. And last but not least, look at other minorities. Boras, for instance. Boras are also very much close to BJP. And when Narendra Modi was chief minister of Gujarat, he was supported by the Sayedna and vice versa. So there is something that is really related to the notion of minorities within minorities, not only the Iranian connection for Shias and so on. Yes, Dalit Muslims. I must say I'm a bit puzzled by the data I have shared with you. And we have just started a huge research project on Muslims in India. And one of the topics we would like to investigate is to identify who are these Arzals. Arzals are the Dalit Muslims. One possibility is that there are so few that they do not make any difference in statistical terms, and we don't know. We don't know because they are not enumerated. But case studies, fieldwork, hopefully will help, and hopefully we'll be back with some response to this question. Certainly, they are at the bottom of the pyramid. But why is the difference between upper caste Muslims and lower caste Muslims so limited in terms of income? Is it because there are very few Dalits within the Muslims? I can't say, and we are working on it.
Thank you. Now, Genius 011 asks a question which I think was typed up a while before you've answered it. Can we just remove caste and religion criteria and just keep the economical class criteria for reservation to benefit economically backward classes across castes and religion? And I'll also take the next question, which relates to it. And that's from Pranva Dhawan. If reservation also signify a demand for recognition beyond a need for emancipation, shouldn't the debate move to more sophisticated models of recognition, like electoral and political reforms that empower historically underrepresented communities? Perhaps that could resolve the challenge of implementing reservations purely for emancipatory goals. So on the one hand, should we have a more economically based criteria, and on the other hand, a more political recognition based?
Yes, good questions again. Well, to use the economic criterion is difficult in India because how do you know how rich someone is? How do you know for sure? And you see how poor the statistical data are for the kind of exercise we are doing. You can certainly imagine how bad the information is so far as the income of each and every family. I mean, for those who are not part of the formal sector, and this is 85% of society. So this is also why people fall back on caste all the time, because at least this is robust. You have a caste certificate, you belong to this category, and that's what policymakers need, robust categories. That's one of the reasons why you need to combine caste and class. I do think so. Another reason is, as I've said, you remove reservations for Dalits because they are rich enough, but the stigma is such that the day after you remove reservation, they are not part of any elite group. You know, look at the professions where there is no reservations for Dalits. You look at the judiciary. Where are the Dalits in the judiciary? A couple of Dalit justices. Peanuts. Where are the Dalits in the Rajya Sabha, in the upper house of parliament? Handful, because there is no reservation. Where there is no reservation, there is no Dalit. In spite of the fact that you have a middle class that has developed among Dalits. So this question of the stigma of untouchability needs to be taken care of, needs to be taken into account. So that's why to combine caste and class, I think is necessary. Pranav is asking something that, in fact, has been somewhat addressed. You have reservations, electoral reservations somewhat at the state level, in the Vidhan Sabha, at the local level, in the Panchayati Raj system. The real problem in terms of recognition there is we don't have separate electorates. You know, this is what Dr. Ambedkar wanted in the early 30s. It would have made, and it would make, a big difference, because for the moment you have a certain percentage of constituencies that is reserved for Dalits, but in none of these constituencies Dalits are in a majority. So those who are elected in these constituencies are accountable to upper caste, intermediate caste, but not to their people. And that's what Ambedkar wanted. He wanted separate electorates. Only Dalits voting for Dalits, Dalit candidates. And these Dalit MLAs, MPs would have been accountable to their people only. If India wants to make a significant progressive reform, it has to return to what Dr. Ambedkar wanted, and it will not.
As we have about 5 minutes left, and there's still about 5 or 6 questions, I might be a bit more selective and pick things from different questions. So alongside the social discrimination at every public space seems to act as an impediment, especially to the poor ones. In this light, are the politics in India that are pursued on the caste lines helping the poor or the lower middle class OBCs, SCs and STs? And at the same time, there's a question about education as one of the main indicator in class differentiation within caste. Of course, you talked about degrees and so on. And the question is, how about language, like knowledge of English within the graduates itself? Does it play any role in social mobility?
Yeah, very good questions again. I will begin with the second one. Language has definitely played a big role in social hierarchies in India, and the English-speaking elite was certainly insulated and benefited from a kind of, I would say, rent. It's a rent-seeking kind of investment to be fluent in English. Now, I would say that we've seen a non-English speaking middle class emerging. This is something, by the way, that Narendra Modi had identified. He called it the neo-middle class. Remember, 2012, for the first time during the Gujarat election campaign, he says, look, there is a new social category in India today. Neo-middle class is emerging. A middle class made of people who do not speak English, who do not have a great education, but who have migrated from the village to the city or to the towns, and who are now part of a kind of urbanization process and somewhat industrialization process as well. So there is a kind of fluidity there, and I think it's the consequence of reservations as well. OBCs have benefited from quota and then from economic growth. This is the story of the 2010s, a decade of growth from 2004 to 2012. The making of a new middle class that is not affected by the language it speaks. That has plateaued, and it is even probably declining. We don't see any neo-middle class left today. And the question is, would language play a role again when you want to climb the social ladder? That's a very, very interesting question that we do not ask sufficiently. We take it for granted, really. Forget the previous question, Tariq, sorry. There were two, I know.
Yeah, okay. It was education as one of the main indicators in class differentiation. So, well, that was the one related to language, sorry. The other one was the social discrimination in public spaces. So the politics in India is, if it's pursued on caste lines, who is it really helping?
Well, it is helping the dominant for sure. And this is something for me that explains the rise of BJP, really. Those who belong to upper caste groups, dominant caste, and who were fearful because of the rise of OBCs after Mandal, because of the rise of Dalits in the wake of BSP's electoral successes, shifted to BJP to protect their interest. Now, they are the not so well educated upper caste Hindus of the Hindi belt, of also Gujarat, Patels supported BJP as early as the mid-90s in reaction to reservations, in reaction to the rise of OBCs that the Congress had started with the CAM coalition. So this caste politics helps dominant caste and upper caste, and the BJP has become their spokesperson, saying, forget about your caste, you're Hindu first. Think about yourself as a Hindu. And therefore, you blur social distinctions and you somewhat return to Marx and its opium of the people. Religion is definitely the opium of the people. When you tell people, you may be backward, you may be Dalit, but you're Hindu. Gar se kaho main Hindu hoon. Say proudly that you are a Hindu. You may be poor, and that will not change. But at least you have this sentiment of dignity. That's exactly the way upper caste, fearing for their future, have instrumentalized religion. And Hindutva is the tool that they have used, and BJP is the party they have used. But of course, BJP has used them too, and they are together in office now. Look at the social composition of this government. It has never been so upper caste dominated since the early 80s. We are back to the pre-Mandal situation. Backward caste have been marginalized, and upper caste are back with a vengeance.
I'm afraid we're coming to the end of our time, so I can't give you all the questions. What I'll do is just pick out a couple, the shortest ones I'll do, and allow you to then respond to them and to sum up. So one question asks if remittances from family members abroad are playing a significant role or any role in shifting the dynamics of inequality in India. And another short question asks about reservation in private sector jobs. Would that help with upward mobilization? And finally, I'll throw something in which is very topical and current. On several occasions, Christophe, you've mentioned the unreliability of large-scale data, and also how the state is collecting less or sharing less. One very big data set that we're getting from India at the moment relates to, obviously, incidences of COVID infections, hospitalizations, fatalities, etc., etc. How reliable are they? How should we interpret the official data that we get on, say, the BBC or read in The Guardian? So feel free to respond as you like and to sum up.
Yeah, I will reply quickly to these three questions, which are very good. Well, remittances play a role definitely in some states, for some groups more than for some others. Clearly, Muslims of Kerala have benefited from remittances more than others. Muslims in general might have probably benefited from remittances more because of the workers of the Gulf countries. It's true for the poorest, for the poorest families, because of course remittances from those who are in the US or in Europe go to richer families, but for the poorest, I think that works, and Muslims have benefited from some of the remittances. Reservations in the private sector, that was one of the plans that was articulated by Manmohan Singh. Remember, he said, reservations in the public sector will not do. It will never be sufficient. So he invited the CII, the Confederation of Indian Industry, he invited the FICCI to think about it. And they thought about it, but they only thought about it. And in fact, so far, no initiative has been made, so far as I know, except some scholarships, some specific support. They don't want reservations in the corporate sector. The corporate sector is allergic to reservations. Even private universities are allergic to reservation, which is a huge problem because privatization of the universities result in less opportunities for the downtrodden of India. And privatization of education is developing very quickly in India, and not only at the university level, at all levels. Figures regarding the COVID pandemic. Of course, we can't rely on these data. The experts say you have to multiply the figures we have by 3, maybe more. And that on the basis of samples. You know, some people are doing it very rigorously. They look at the death certificates of the month of April in 2020 and the number of death certificates in the month of April 2021. They've done that for Gujarat. And they realize that the number is 3 times higher this year, when officially there is only a very marginal difference. So this is where the state is completely dysfunctional. Its official figures, death certificates, say something they deny when they give the number of people who died because of COVID. They will stop giving birth certificates data for sure. And that's why you will need to count the bodies in the Ganga, and you will need to look at the crematorium from the sky with drones. Dozens of journalists are doing it to inform the people. And incidentally, many of them died of COVID by visiting hospitals, by visiting crematoriums, and so on and so forth. That's what we see in UP, for instance, Uttar Pradesh. So yeah, again, official data will become very complicated to use. They are already very complicated to use. We'll see what the census looks like, but 2021 was supposed to be a census year. Will it be? And what will the census look like?
Well, thank you very much, Christophe. I mean, that's been so instructive for me. I must have been one of the, the least informed people who joined, excuse me, who joined this webinar. And I must say, I learned a lot, but I still don't quite have a handle on some of these categories as basic as caste. I mean, the idea that there are many Sikh Dalits, in fact, more Sikh Dalits as a proportion of Sikhs to Hindu Dalits, and Muslim Dalits, it's all just a little too confusing for me because obviously the ideology of Sikhs and Islam has no space for Dalits. But obviously this is a socio-political, sociological analysis and economic, and I've learned a lot. So thank you very much. And thank you for all of you who joined us. I hope you found it as illuminating as I did. This is actually our last webinar for this term. We have a couple of postgraduate lunchtime presentations. So if you're on the invitation list for that, you'll get an invitation shortly.